So, welcome to another expert talk in survivor engagement, which has been brought to you by VoiceOver, which is a project funded by the European Union to explore and to encourage and support engagement in real time with survivors of the travesty of human trafficking and sexual exploitation, which has been on our minds across this 2-year project. And we hope that this brings you, as people who work in this field, interested in this field, real support and information and knowledge to move forward your work and your engagement and your understanding of this really tough area and important area of work. And today, to look at the importance of this in relation to victimhood and humanitarian engagement of all sorts, we have with us Professor Lilie Chouliaraki from the LSE, the London School of Economics, where she is a professor of the Department of Media and Communication. And it's a great delight to have you here with us for this webinar, Lilie.
The pleasure is all mine. Thank you so much for having me.
It's a delight to have you. And for those of you who get intrigued, which I'm sure that's the majority of you here who stay on for this half-hour engagement with Professor Lilie, there are a couple of books which brought both Lilie to our attention as a project that will help us and steer this conversation. One of those was called The Ironic Spectator, Solidarity in the Age of Post-Humanitarianism. And the other one is Wronged, The Weaponization of Victimhood, which is, again, an intriguing title. It's a provocative title, and it's one we want to dig into pretty quickly now as we get going with this conversation. Lilie, thank you so much for making yourself available for this webinar. I guess I want to just kick off with an invitation to look at how victimhood, why you went for exploring victimhood, what it means in terms of the language that's used around victimhood, and how that's used, what's this weaponization thing about as a tool of power? How is that, how does that work out?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Carrie. I mean, I'm delighted to be here and engage in conversation with you. So the best way, I think, to kind of start answering this question is to define victimhood, to say what victimhood means, and how I use it in my own work. So in the book that you just mentioned, Wronged, I define, I approach victimhood as the communication of suffering and pain that places the victim, the perpetrator, and the benefactor at the heart of our public conversations. And to be more specific, victimhood is about claims to suffering. I'm traumatized, I'm injured, I'm wronged, that confer moral status to those who claim it. And they also distribute responsibility for the infliction or the relief of suffering to other actors. In other words, there is always a benefactor and a perpetrator when someone claims, I am a victim. And so the question that I ask in the book is about powerful people using victimhood and using victimhood in our politics, in our culture, in our collective conversations, wherever these take place. What does it mean when powerful actors, and usually these are privileged white men who are sheltered from most forms of harm, like, let's say, the obvious examples are Trump or Musk, style themselves as the victim and point to other people, usually vulnerable people like migrants, like women, as their perpetrators.
So you're talking
yeah.
about a flipping of those who really are the systemic victims of what goes on in this world, right?
Exactly.
The flipping of that and the possession of it, or the corralling of it, the taking hold of it by those who are politically powerful and economically powerful people.
Precisely that. So I was intrigued by that idea that in our politics and our culture today, what we see more and more, particularly by far-right actors, is this reversal of victimhood, right? Where the powerful ones take the mantle of the victim and accuse systemically vulnerable people for being perpetrators, either of themselves, meaning the powerful politicians, or the nation as a whole, or any collectivity or political community that they refer to. And I think asking this question about the role of victimhood when used by the powerful, and what that does in our public sphere, in our public conversation, has been very helpful. At least that's what I found out in my own study, because what it does is it helps us challenge conventional meanings of victimhood that we are kind of all usually employ in our everyday conversations, in our daily life. And if I may say just a couple of things on that, because there are two different ways, I think, in which thinking about victimhood as a claim of the powerful helps us challenge how we understand victimhood. So the first challenge bit is that it kind of makes us question the assumption that victimhood is only a psychological reality that we carry inside us, that somehow it is a pain that we carry in our souls, in our bodies, and it is something that shapes our emotional core. And of course, the idea of victimhood is important, and it speaks to our lived experience and the realities of most of us. But thinking of victimhood only as psychological pain leaves out an important dimension. And this is the dimension of victimhood as speech, as narrative that we use to describe ourselves and make sense of ourselves and others. So one of the things I say in the book is that when we use expressions like I am traumatized, I'm triggered, or someone committed an injustice against me, I am communicating something about myself. Victimhood here is a performance of who I am in public and a form of identity that attaches moral value to me who claims it.
Right.
Yeah, so I think that's important. It's important to see victimhood not as pain that I carry, but also as a linguistic choice that I make to
Yeah,
communicate who
and
I am.
a tool that can be used in public discourse to access resources, to access public, an audience, to access political power, which is where you started off from, to say,
Yes,
well, look, isn't it interesting how
exactly.
Trump
Yeah.
has used victimhood to even increase his political purchase and power across the United States. Now, this is what came into my mind as you were talking here, Lilie, was, the megaphone. That is the visual image. It's the logo for the voice over project. You know, you're talking about victimhood, um, not only as something that people are carrying, but actually that really does have a power in relationship to take who's got the microphone, who's got the megaphone. Um, so if we can talk a little bit about, once you understand the narrative piece,
Yes.
how does that work out really for how survivors and those working with survivors don't simply confine people to a sort of victimhood which diminishes their ability to access a megaphone, but
Yes.
enables them to have a place around the table.
I think that is the core question, and that would be actually the second thing I would say in relation to how victimhood needs to be challenged, and I'm trying to challenge it in the book Wronged. And this is because we usually associate victimhood with powerlessness, with a lack of agency, with a lack of protection, a lack of opportunity, a lack of voice, ultimately. Um, However, I think because victimhood is profoundly social, it's a speech act, it's a narrative, as I said. And so it's a form of identity as well. Victimhood cannot really be separated from the power structures of society. So when we talk about victimhood, instead of automatically assuming that here we're talking about voiceless, powerless people, it is more important to ask the question of what is the context within which this claim to victimhood is being made? This linguistic choice to claim that I'm victim is being made. And I think once we start asking questions of context, who is claiming victimhood? What are the conditions of structural vulnerability this claimant speaks from? What is the purpose and the narrative behind that claim to victimhood? I think a whole range of things, the sociological, if you like, context of victimhood becomes much more obvious, and we are much more clear-headed in terms of our own evaluation, moral evaluation of the status of victimhood that we are confronted with. And I think, at the heart of it is this idea that, which you just mentioned, that usually those who already have power, those who already have the forms of capital, right? Linguistic capital, social capital, economic capital, of course, believability capital. Some people say they are victims and they are believed, and others are never believed, right? So these are all forms of capital that enable some, usually those who are already powerful, to be heard and eventually dominate and be recognized in the public sphere as legitimate victims, whereas the rest remain misrecognized and silenced. And here I think the distinction between on the one hand, claims and narratives of victimhood is important. Everybody can do that. Everybody can muster emotion and action around their suffering. But there is a difference from being systemically vulnerable, which is about how much are you exposed to different structures of violence, poverty, racism, sexism, homophobia. And I think keeping that distinction in mind and knowing that victimhood is not about powerlessness, but about power, are really important tools in kind of deciphering and decoding a lot of the political conversations that are taking place right now.
So how come and the not just the political conversations, but actually, the social organization conversations that aren't even a conversation. they are a diktat, because it's the way that the government, the state runs. It's the system in which social workers operate out of. It's the system in which NGOs are busy competing for increasingly limited resources to access their work. I wonder whether we can just have a little tease out of these different forms of capital, because I think for many people, thinking about where people are within the wider context of their lives, in terms of the different aspects of capital that they can call on, whether it's credibility capital, whether it's their economic capital. Most people are able to think about that one. But what about all the other resources, the ability to make claims on the state as citizens, etc.? How does that all work in terms of what can be done in terms of, if you're a social worker, for instance, really starting to explore the vulnerability and the not just the victimhood, but let's use some other terms around it, the inability of people to find the way to the microphone, to find the way to the megaphone in those arenas to access the things they need. Can we talk a bit about those different areas of capital?
Yes, certainly. I think one of the kind of most important elements that define how different categories of people, whether they are social groups or individuals, can access the microphone, as you said, and can have the ability and the power to be heard, is today defined by social media platforms. This is where conversation takes place. And it is also defined more generally by ways of talking and ways of engaging in the public sphere that are, again, kind of informed very much by an individualistic competitive culture of neoliberal capitalism. I think these are the kind of two cornerstones of public communication today. So forms of capital need to translate into audibility and power within that framework. So you can say that someone, let's say academics or other types of experts, may have indeed the knowledge capital and the legitimacy and the experience conferred upon them by their long-term careers or their positions in prestigious universities. However, unless that also translates into popularity into a social media platform or a celebrity status that enables you to kind of be accessed by the mainstream media and appear to talk about different issues as authority, your work might never really reach the wider public. It may be confined within the kind of terrain of the university, the libraries, the classroom, etc., etc. That's not necessarily bad. But if we are talking about the competition of voices and who has the power to be heard, who has the legitimacy and ultimately the audibility, what we are seeing is that we're not talking about a level playing field. We are talking about a very skewed field of conversation and public communication, where independently of expertise, knowledge, truth-telling, those who will eventually be heard are those who have the popularity already, those who have the celebrity status, those who are already in a way legitimized within that sphere of commodified consumption and social media platforms. And we see the bad consequences of that because there is so much, I mean, we talk about our society being a society of post-truth. I mean, post-truth has to do precisely with that. We need to ask the question of who has the capital to circulate knowledge, to make claims, whether of victimhood or otherwise, in the public sphere. And why are certain voices that are being louder but less truthful, that are engaged in games of disinformation and misinformation, being heard much more than voices of expertise?
So can I just thank you for that, Lilie? I mean, when you're looking at conversation, lots of the conversation that's on social media actually isn't very conversationalist at all. It's people announcing things at one another and nobody listening. Whereas conversation is primarily at its very heart a dialogue, a listening between those who respect one another, and I just wonder if we could just bring this down, aware that we have people here who are busy trying to work their way through getting the voice of those who've experienced the multiple violations that emerge through the trafficking vector, the trafficking experience, how to bring that voice and give it legitimacy. I took that away from that capital of believability. It's that legitimization of the voice that I think is so critical in this area when you're talking about trying to manage, not through the environment necessarily of social media, which does one job. It does one job. But doing that through the governmental, bureaucratic processes that have already decided who the experts are and who aren't, who are the legitimate people who are going to dispense whatever is going to be dispensed to those who have been found to have been victims of trafficking, how to bring legitimacy to the table for them to enable those who are victims to play their proper part as the experts of their lived experience around the table to those who the bureaucracy has decided are legitimate and haven't actually included them around the table. How does that work, do you think?
Well, I think, first of all, I just need to reference the fact that the humanitarian and human rights sector, which obviously includes, and it's a big part of that, work on anti-trafficking and the rights of marginalized groups and women and feminities in particular, that sector is the most important carrier, in my view, still today, as part of the broader global governance network to facilitate, provide legitimacy, and give voice to those actors. I don't think at the moment we have any other political institutional actors who can mediate and facilitate the audibility of the voice of the marginalized into governmental bodies or any other form of decision-making institution but that sector. So I have.
So can you tell us a bit more about that? How does that work? Where's that legitimation coming from?
I think, well, I mean, the humanitarian and human rights sector has a huge tradition of voice giving. I mean, that is the whole point of that sector. It was born out of an arrangement of the post-Second World War global order, which is we operate on the basis of individual human rights. We believe in equality and a system of global governance that is based on the respect of the dignity of every single life, no matter where it finds itself. And so it is part of its raison d'etre, so to speak, to be able to not only speak on behalf of those people, but also to give voice to those people, to allow their voice to be heard and their narratives to be heard, either in national governments or the UN or other major transnational institutions and organizations. I think what is happening today with the humanitarian and human rights sector is that precisely because of the global competition and the kind of neoliberal professionalization that you mentioned briefly, and I also kind of touched upon earlier, what we are seeing is a push towards more individualized, emotionally appealing forms of communicating victimhood and suffering. And I think in terms of public communication more, rather than in terms of intergovernmental or interinstitutional communication, what we are seeing, and that's the object of my book that you mentioned just earlier, The Ironic Spectator, is we are seeing this post-humanitarian turn, which is more sleek, advertisement-like campaigns that brand the organization rather than explain the causes of suffering or give voice to those people. So we have more emphasis maybe on entertainment over political engagement, more personal experience and consumption over an explicit ethics of solidarity. And ultimately, I think what we are seeing in the past maybe 15 years is a depoliticization of global issues. And here I know, and I agree with you that the social media platforms are not everything, but I think social media platforms have also played a key role in the way humanitarian and human rights organizations communicate the plight of vulnerable others to the world. And in a way, when you reduce everything to a click, click for a donation, click to sign a petition, then in a way you present issues of global justice as lifestyle choices and as kind of easy solutions. Is that not right? I mean, I think that's it. And I think what is missing from all this, perhaps, is, again, resituating human rights you know, in collectivist narratives of justice. I think that is what is really important. And in the book, I talk about trauma. Trauma is a language of pain because it speaks about the personal, emotional experiences of suffering of survivors, for instance, right? So trauma is a language of suffering that has historically been linked to public testimonies of suffering as a force of justice and social change. That is what trauma has been, both in the feminist movements of the 60s and before that. You know, the kind
well,
of
in the
in
anti-slavery
anti-slavery,
movement, it was extremely powerful.
extremely powerful in anti-slavery, the feminism of the mid-20th century, the Holocaust and the testimonies of survivors from the camps. All of this, that legacy, in a way, carries within it the demand for justice and the demand for change. How can it be reintegrated into the narratives of humanitarian and human rights organizations in ways that can kind of make more explicit that demand for structural change? I think that is an you know an important question to ask. And similarly, I would say with human rights, one of the things we are seeing with the language of rights is an individualization of that. It's my right. And again, I would go back to social media platforms, not only because I'm a communications and media specialist, but because it does structurally reorganize the ways in which public discourse appears to most of us. And I would say, again, we need to ask the question of how can we disarticulate rights from that personalized idea of my freedom, and the expression of sorry, my personal desire. This is not what human rights is. This is a very particular appropriation of rights. Rights is underpinned by a conception of freedom as the right of all to be shielded from structural violence and to thrive together. And to thrive together in recognition of each other's vulnerability. So some work needs to be done for us to kind of redefine, reappropriate, and integrate the languages of pain, trauma, and rights into collectivist narratives where the demand for justice becomes more explicit and more obvious.
Well, you know, I mean, I think what you've given everybody here, and what I mean, I would love to now dig into another area of this. And I think this whole thing of who is in the NGO sector, what is the ethic that is driving your particular NGO, what is the ethic that is underpinning your social services role and profession, what is the ethic that is indeed inspiring some people to then start up whole new movements around, which are emerging all the time in counter trafficking? Is it built on a sort of actually a semi-individualization of everything? Or is there really the work being done in understanding the systemic, which after all, you know, it's where we started out in terms of saying who has the capital, how is it being distributed in all these different sectors? Now, Lilie, is this not, you know, just extremely political and tough message coming back into the humanitarian sector? Is this the critique that you are laying out in your The Ironic Spectator?
Yes, it is. It is. And both in the Ironic Spectator and a volume I co-edited more recently, which is the Handbook of Humanitarian Communication, this is exactly my core claim, is that we need, the humanitarian sector tried for decades to claim legitimacy in the sphere of global governance precisely by arguing and presenting itself as an apolitical sphere that cares about human suffering. And
Absolutely.
what I have tried to say, and I'm not alone in that, there is a whole range of experts and activists who have engaged with these questions profoundly. What I'm saying is that there is no separation of the humanitarian imperative and politics. That we cannot separate the two. And that's another way of saying that victimhood itself is not a neutral category. Victimhood itself is enmeshed in relations of power. And that's why it is really important to bring back the language of social justice as the only political language that can, in fact, address the fundamental concern of the humanitarian sector, which is protect everyone from structural violence, from all its forms, and make sure that we all thrive together in recognition of our shared vulnerabilities, particularly those who are most exposed to forms of violence around the world. And I don't think that this connection between social justice and humanitarian communication is being achieved at the moment, precisely for the reasons that I gave earlier and we discussed briefly, which has to do with just the kind of the professionalization of the sector, which is another word of saying the commercialization of the sector, the global competition and the kind of neoliberal conditions of the market within which that sector needs to operate. So there is a tension there between the demand for politicization and articulation of justice on the one hand, and the commercialization that is at the same time taking place and kind of pulls the sector in another direction. So I think it's a very difficult balance. Sorry, yeah, but I think it's worth posing the questions again.
I think, well, I'm really very struck by what you've been saying, particularly even more so, in what's just recently now unfolding with this new nationalism that is emerging in the sector. If you have the US cutting its aid into these arenas, we see actually this old shibboleth of the national xenophobia starting to kick in, which has no place in the way that you described what the foundation stone of human rights as one of deep mutual respect and recognition of the way that systems erode and threaten citizens within communities.
I completely agree. And just one kind of final sentence on this. I would say, yes, we live in times of unprecedented inequalities, in fact, unprecedented violence and cruelty. And we're going to see much more of that in the months and years to come, unfortunately. But at the same time, questions of redistribution, as much as questions of recognition, remain unresolved. They are kind of still open to be claimed and to be rearticulated and to become political forces for resistance and change. So one of the things that I think is important to make clear is that when we're talking about structural vulnerability, we are not really talking about victimhood. We are talking about injustice. And the relationship between the two is something we need to unpack, and to unpack it every time in its own context. So that's part of the kind of work I've been trying to do, together with many others, of course.
Oh, Lilie, Professor Lilie Chouliaraki, wonderful to engage with you for this precious half hour. And I hope that those of you who are coming into this webinar to enjoy and to be stimulated and encouraged to press on in the tough work that remains to be done, we'll also make use of the other webinars and podcasts that have been accumulated over this 2-year program funded by the European Union. We have our own webpage, the VoiceOver webpage. If you look through on the chat or on the final slide, you'll find the links for that and for the books to which Lilie referred to in this fascinating conversation. Lilie, my thanks to you, our thanks to you from the VoiceOver Project for giving up your time and sharing your thoughts with us in such a helpful, engaging, and provocative manner. Really so appreciated.
I thank you very much for this honor and pleasure. And I hope we have the opportunity to continue this conversation, this important conversation that you're hosting in the webinar series. Thank you very much.